Hello everyone, welcome to Study Vibes with Ash. This is part 2 of MPSE 3 Western Political Thought from Plato to Marx. I hope आपने जो पहला पार्ट है इस इस वाले पेपर का वो आपने देख लिया है और जिन्होंने भी अभी तक चैनल को सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया है प्लीज़ डू सब्सक्राइब द चैनल एंड रेंडर योर सपोर्ट. ऑल्सो डू लाइक शेयर एंड कॉमेंट. आपको अगर और कोई स्पेसिफिक पेपर्स पे भी चाहिए तो कमेंट्स में ज़रूर डाल दीजिएगा. अगर हो सके तो मैं ज़रूर बनाऊँगी. एंड या सो लेट्स कंटिन्यू. दिस इज़ कंटिन्यूएशन फ्रॉम पार्ट 1. सो पहले पार्ट 1 वाली वीडियो आपने देख ली होगी. सो दिस इज़ पार्ट 2 ऑफ इट. सो नेक्स्ट थिंकर इज Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So what is Rousseau's critique of civil society? So he criticized civil society for corrupting human beings through private property and inequality. And he believes that it is through private property and inequality that we have become morally decayed and eventually it will lead to oppression. Now, what is civil society and its corruption? So in the state of nature, wherein humans are free, equal and harmonious, private property will bring in what? Inequality, because not everybody will be having the same amount of property, then competition as well as social divisions. Then civil society will bring in dependence, for social approval, and material wealth will lead to moral corruption. Then he Rousseau felt that social contract is the solution, wherein the general will is represented in the collective interest for common good, and that is represented in this contract wherein individuals will collectively create a political body, and that is a representation of their will, and society should promote equality, liberty and fraternity rather than serving private interests. So his solution to the corruption of civil society is a political system which is based on general will, that is people's will, to restore freedom and equality through the social contract. Now, what is Rousseau's concept of general will? So general will is central to Rousseau's political theory, and this general will be representing the collective interest of society. So general will means the unified will of the people who are all aiming at something common, and it is distinct from individual desires. In fact, it is above selfish interests. So citizens must submit their personal will to general will. That is, sometimes they might have to give up on their personal interest. For example, let's say people want to be rich or have so much of money, but the general will would be give something for charity or something. Now general will and sovereignty. Sovereignty again belongs to people as a whole, and acting according to the general will ensure true freedom. And when you participate in forming in this general will discussions, that is when laws become legitimized. For example, any law that is made in India is legitimate because people have elected the representatives, and those representatives ये वाली law बना रही है, so they are directly involved. Now what is the role of government? Government's role is to execute the general will. At the same time, government will be responsible for it, and which is why government can be replaced if they cannot enforce the collective interest. So for conclusion, he gave interest to what? Collective interest as well as active participation, and these two to be the legitimate authority and true freedom. Now, Rousseau's attempt to reconcile liberty with authority. So he argued that there's no the idea that you don't need a free government for the state of nature is the best, as what Hobbes said or something like that. That is not true. In fact, liberty and authority can coexist so long as the authority will reflect the general will. So what is liberty? Liberty is, or true freedom is, when you are acting according to law, and those laws are being created with your help. So the people have formulated some laws. Now people should act according to those laws. When you act according to those laws, that's true freedom. And civil society will have to give up certain natural freedoms for security and equality. Now what is the role of authority? Authority will enforce the laws, and these laws are again a reflection of general will. Unlike Hobbes, he said that authority is based on collective participation. They are like people's leader. Now social contract should be the basis of authority. That is, individuals will surrender the individual will to form a collective will. Also, this participation in the general will ensure that there will be political freedom, as well as the laws made are nothing but legitimate. So now what is conclusion? Liberty is achieved through participation in the general will, and that makes authority legitimate. and also be in sync with individual freedom. Now, what is Rousseau's sovereign compared to Hobbes' Leviathan? So, Rousseau and Hobbes' concept of sovereignty was different in terms of its nature, purpose, and legitimacy. Hobbes' concept of Leviathan. So, there he saw authority to be indivisible and absolute if you want to prevent war of all against all. And he believed that this legitimacy of the powerful or comes in when you surrender all the rights and there should be no resistance. In fact, he was the one who argued that resistance, any form of resistance, can be tackled by the government even by being immoral if it comes to that. Now, Rousseau's sovereign stated that this sovereign power is based on general will and that represents the common good. So, sovereign is a collective authority, it is never a single ruler. And this authority is legitimate only if it promotes equality, freedom, and common good. Also, the right to resist. Hobbes stated that rebellion is unjustifiable, but Rousseau accepted the fact that people can protest if the government is not acting according to general will. So, for conclusion, Hobbes favored obedience to a single sovereign, while Rousseau favors collective sovereignty, popular participation, and resistance against unjust authority. Then, next concept or the thinker is Jeremy Bentham. So, his principle, Bentham's utilitarian principle. So, Bentham's utilitarian principle asserts that the morally right action will maximize happiness for the greatest number, and that forms the basis of his moral philosophy and practical ethics. With this, what utilitarian principle is, that is, moral action is something that will bring about maximum number of people's benefits. So, greatest happiness principle, that is, actions are right if they increase overall happiness and wrong if they produce more pain than pleasure, and happiness being synonymous with pleasure, that is, human action is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Hedonistic calculus. So, this was a systemic method to evaluate the consequence of one's actions. So, what were the factors? The intensity, duration, certainty, and proximity to pleasure or pain. And this provides a very practical and measurable framework for ethical decision making. Then, equality in happiness. That is, everyone's happiness counts equally. No individual's welfare is prioritized over another's. So, that is a very democratic and egalitarian principle in happiness, because everybody's happiness should be seen equally. Now, for example, for that is public health policies, universal healthcare facilities, wherein it is accessible for all, even if it might benefit some more and some less, it doesn't matter. It should be appealing to everyone equally. So, Bentham's utilitarian principle provided a pragmatic and outcome-based moral framework, and this influenced law, politics, and ethics. But it was criticized for what? For overriding individual rights, because what is it saying? So long as the greater number is happy, it's fine, but that means there is a smaller number which may not be happy with it. Then, what is Bentham's political philosophy? Again, it's grounded in utilitarian ethics, which emphasize that government should maximize citizens' happiness. Now, what is government's role? Promoting happiness. Political decisions should be a balance of pleasure and pain. Government should be rational, pragmatic, and focused on social welfare. And the critique of traditional systems. So, monarchies and aristocracies are inefficient and unjust. In fact, they favor elites, while democracy is the one that will reflect the major interests. Then, universal suffrage and reform. He advocated for voting rights. Why? Because that would again reflect the larger numbers' opinion. Influence movements for expanded democratic participation. For example, prison and legal reform. That justice should be focused on rehabilitation more than punishment, because pleasure is more important. Panopticon prison model was exemplified as efficient, and it will bring in human supervision. Now, Bentham's political philosophy promotes democratic government, social welfare, and rational policies, which aims at what? Collective happiness. Next is Bentham on Panopticon. So, Panopticon is actually Bentham's prison design that emphasizes efficient surveillance and self-regulation. So, what is a design? There is a centralized surveillance, because there is a circular building with a central observation tower. So, prisoners will never know whether they are being observed. So, that will create an asymmetry of knowledge, and they will behave in very naturally. Then, psychological impact or self-regulation. So, prisoners will modify their behavior Because of what? But they will know that they are being watched, but they don't know when they will be watched. So they will always regulate their behavior, which means that fear that they will be watched is more than enough. You need not go there and supervise them 24/7. That will bring in a certain amount of efficiency and order. Now, this surveillance can be extended even to schools, hospitals, factories, etc. because it will encourage what? Compliance and productivity through the belief that there is an observation happening. For example, the modern surveillance systems are like that. CCTVs or online tracking are all based on panopticon principle, wherein there is a centralized observation or surveillance. So for conclusion, panopticon illustrates the influence of observation on behavior, and it highlights the balance between control efficiency and individual freedom. Bentham's theory of utilitarianism, it's already explained. It evaluates the morality based on consequences. So what is the principle of utility? Actions are morally right if they produce the greatest happiness for greatest number. Pleasure is the measure of human well-being. Then hedonistic calculus, then equality of happiness, wherein everyone's happiness should be counted equally. And this example you can see in social welfare policies, like allocation of resources to healthcare or education is justified because that will bring in what? Overall happiness. Okay. Next is J.S. Mill. So what are his views on representative government? This is a very repeated area, like theories on J.S. Mill or theories of J.S. Mill. Okay. So for introduction, he argued that representative democracy is the best system because it balances individual liberty with social welfare. It brings about accountability, encourages political participation, and promotes competent decision making. Now, representative government is a system of accountability. Why? Because elected officials will be acting on behalf of the people and they are accountable to them. Why? Because they need a majority rule. Because once they lose that, people support, they'll lose their power. So, majority rule is essential, but safeguards should be there to prevent it from becoming tyranny. And representatives must always govern according to the utilitarian aim of maximizing collective happiness. There is no policy that is perfect. जितनी भी policies बनाए वो अगर majority को favor करेगी तो ठीक ठाक ही होगा. Universal suffrage and education. He believed in universal suffrage, but that voting should be informed. Simply, enabling everybody to vote is not enough. They should be educated voters to ensure competent political decision. So education was the necessary aspect for responsible electorate. The role of minorities. Of course, their rights need to be protected. In fact, a good democracy must safeguard minorities from being overpowered by majority. For example, is women's suffrage. At that point of time, during Mill's time, women did not have voting rights. So he supported women's political rights and encouraged them to come into public life. And that sort of influenced early feminist movements. So for conclusion, Mill's theory shaped modern democratic thought by promoting universal suffrage, political education and minority protection. Then Mill's justification for individual liberty. So in his work on liberty, Mill defends personal freedom and limits the state intervention to actions that harm others. He believed that liberty is essential for personal growth and progress. Hence, state's intervention should be very limited. Limited as in it should never harm. So what is the harm principle? That is, power can be exercised over an individual only if there is a threat. Self-regarding acts must remain free because they are not affecting public welfare. Now, self-development and flourishing. He argued that liberty allows people to explore different ways of life, develop their abilities and seek happiness, and diversity of choices and opinions helps societies grow intellectually and morally. Now, what is government's role? Limiting interference. Government should intervene only when actions threaten others. Mill also warned against majority tyranny, wherein he felt that when there is a public opinion, it will suppress the individual opinion, like free speech, that all opinions, whether false, unpopular, wrong, whatever, they should be allowed because open debates are the basis for what truths and for progress as well. So, on liberty, he defended liberty and he considered that to be a foundation to liberal democracy. Mill's justification for equal rights for women. In his work, The Subjection of Women, Mill argued that women's inequality is unjust and socially harmful because he felt that gender differences are due to culture and not nature. Now, what is social and legal inequality? He said that women's subordination is due to destructive laws and customs, not because of biological. So, once you remove these inequalities, the society will also benefit. Women's right to vote and participation in public life. He supported both these things because once they are excluded from public life, you are taking away some valuable contributions to society. For example, championing the women's suffrage movement, especially in Britain and US. These movements were strengthened by Mill's arguments. So for conclusion, his advocacy helped shape the modern feminism. In fact, the first wave of feminism in the West was for suffrage, and that was influenced by seminal works like The Subjection of Women. Then his observation about liberty. So he believed that there should be a balance between freedom and authority. His focus was on protecting individual liberty from both state overreach and majority pressure. Now, what is tyranny of the majority? Because majorities can always suppress minorities. But true democracy happens or occurs when you can protect the minority rights. Then what are the limits of authority or the harm principle? Harm principle will set the limit of legitimate coercion. Any action that is causing harm to another can be restricted. But any other choice that is only affecting themselves or for their growth, they must be let free. Self-expression and personal growth. Freedom of thought, lifestyle and expression is essential for personal and social development. In fact, there must be allowed to have, there must be a freedom to have different ways of living. That's the only way in which one can grow. And the best example for that is free speech. So for conclusion, he considered liberty to be the most central pillar to democracy. Now again, his views on utilitarianism. He refined Bentham's utilitarianism by bringing in different qualities of pleasure and emphasizing long-term human well-being. Now, quality versus quantity of pleasures. So he argued that the higher pleasures are always intellectual and moral and not physical pleasures. But anybody who enjoys the intellectual and moral pleasures will definitely prefer the higher pleasures, and because that's the way in which you can be happy. Now, greatest happiness for greatest number, which he believed in them, but he also said that it should be long term and of high quality. Because so long as your virtues and moral characters are not developed, there is no point in all of these things. Utilitarianism and justice, by arguing that these two are linked and that protecting rights and fairness will again lead to more happiness. Because justice will bring in what? Security, stability and moral development. The best example is social reforms. Due to education, women's rights and welfare, all of these things are important because in the long run, they will reduce inequality. So, for conclusion, Mill added depth to Bentham's theory and emphasized on quality, justice and long-term social improvement. Okay, now the next thinker is Immanuel Kant. Now Kant's critique of natural rights and social contract. This was asked in June, but मैं फिर भी दे रही हूँ because if a question is asked on Immanuel Kant, you can add these points. So Kant challenged traditional natural rights theory and social contract accounts by grounding political authority, moral autonomy and rational law. So he critiqued natural rights as pre-political and individualistic. Rather, he said that rights will come only within a public and lawful condition, which he called as Rechtsstaat. That is, true rights must always be grounded in universal moral law. It is not subjective, because when you say what is natural to me may not be natural to you, but rights are always universal for the proponents of natural rights. But he said that they should be within a lawful and public sphere. Only within that sphere rights will be generated. Critique of social contract. Again, he critiqued these contracts and stated that this social contract is nothing but an idea of reason, which expresses the requirement that laws should be capable of universal consent. And legitimacy comes from the state's rational structure, which will respect autonomy and justice. So, for example, the state. State is justified because there is a requirement as well as universal consent for it, and it becomes legitimacy. It becomes legitimate because it stands for justice and autonomy. Or to put it another way, so long as the state enables citizens to follow moral law under a system of public justice, then state is relevant. Otherwise, just because there was an old contract that was created centuries ago, there is no need for anything. So he redefined political legitimacy through autonomy and universal law, and he was against the traditional natural rights and contract theories. His idea of perpetual peace. So Kant's perpetual peace outlines principles for lasting international peace and moral duties of state. Now, what are the conditions of perpetual peace? he proposed preliminary steps towards peace, like you should not have standing armies, you should respect the sovereignty of each other, you should not intervene in each other's business, then republican constitutions. Why? Because citizens will less likely go for a war because everybody wants peace. It's only the leaders who will want war. Now, what is the role of international law? He envisioned a federation of free states who are governed by shared law rather than force. In fact, this idea of free state was a early model of modern international institutions, right? Like UN or WTO in the modern times, who all have a certain law, but they'll not do anything forceful on one another. Like international organizations, like UN or League of Nations, reflect Kant's ideas, wherein peace is achieved through cooperation, law, and mutual accountability. So his peace theory is grounded on modern international law, republicanism, and legal federation remain central to global peace efforts. Then Kant's conception of universal law of rights. His universal law of rights derives from the categorical imperative and establishes universal innate rights for all rational beings. The categorical imperative and universal rights are rights which are based on maxims that can be universalized. In fact, freedom is the fundamental innate right, and every other right is based on this freedom. And these are valid independently of positive law. Now, rights and justice. Rights are based on rational morality, and state must enforce them to secure autonomy and a condition of justice. Example, universal human rights. They are a reflection of Kant's view that rights are universal and inherent. In fact, states need not give them. So human rights is not something that a government should give, which is why even if there is a violation in any part of the world, there are criticisms. So he provides a philosophical foundation for universal human rights and legal equality. Next is Kant's political philosophy being considered international in character. So it is not merely based on one particular state. In fact, it's based on justice and peace. So that is very cosmopolitan. So his idea of international federation of states. He advocated a federation, not a world government, of republican states who are committed to shared values and peaceful coexistence. Now, moral law beyond borders, that state must act according to moral law, just like how individuals do. In fact, justice, peace, and respect for rights are applicable even internationally, like European Union. They work under principles of cooperation under common laws, promote stability and peace among states. So, this cosmopolitan political philosophy shaped the modern ideas of global governance, human rights, and international justice. Now, what is Kant's view on social contract and the state? He was different from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau by treating social contract not as a historical event, but as something very rational and moral, which justifies the political authority. So, he saw that as a moral obligation. It is not an agreement per se, it's an obligation that the government has, where the state should protect under the universal just laws. In fact, the state becomes legitimate only if it upholds autonomy and equal freedom. Now, the state has a system of law. Kant supported a republican state where laws are public, rational, and universally applicable. So, then the state secures freedom by enforcing a system of rights. Example is his theory, constitutional theory. In fact, many constitutional democracies reflect Kant's emphasis on legality, rights, and due process. So, for conclusion, he sees the state as a rational, ethical institution that exists to secure freedom and justice, not merely to prevent conflict. Now, Kant's transcendental idealist view of human reason. It holds that mind actively structures the experience, which is quite different from the earlier theories. Now, the role of human reason in experience. We know only phenomena, not things in themselves. Space, time, and categories like causality are mental frameworks that make experience possible. So, he believed that human reason lies in what experience. So, it is our mind and our knowledge that is shaping up what our thought process. Now, the limits of knowledge. Reason can never access the nominal world, and knowledge is limited by these structures of mind. Best example is the Copernican revolutionary philosophy. So, he shifts philosophy from object shaping the mind to the mind shaping the experience, which actually influence later movements like phenomenology. So, phenomenology is what? It is a theory that tries to analyze on how we experience things rather than why we are experiencing it. So they sort of take things as they appear, which is what Kant also said, that it is not an idea or object that is shaping the mind, but it is our experience. Sorry, it is our experience or our mind shaping the experience. That is, our experience will be regarded as good or bad based on what our mind is saying. And in fact, that's the limit of our knowledge. So his idealism reshaped modern epistemology by showing that reason is what actively forms the world we experience, which is why the same experience can be both negative and positive for two different people. Now, what is Immanuel Kant's views on human reason? So he distinguishes between pure reason, which is knowledge, and practical reason, that is morality. So he combined knowledge with ethics. Pure reason is the theoretical knowledge. So that gives prioritized structures like space, time categories and all. So that is the basis for understanding. Practical reason is the moral action. Practical reason will guide our moral action through and that will require a universalizable maxims and duty based ethics. Like for example, his ethics of duty. Duties will illustrate acts based on rational moral law, and they are not consequences, right? Our duties are a basis of what are moral laws that we have. They are not a consequence of something that we do. So for conclusion, his theory of reason remains central to modern philosophy, and it links knowledge and morality. Now Hegel's philosophy of history. Hegel is the next thinker. So he saw history as a rational process through which human freedom develops. Then history as a rational process. And history unfolds through the world spirit, which realizes freedom, with each era. So it's a very rational process. It's not something that is, very mechanical. The dialectical process in history. So he developed a process of thesis, antithesis and synthesis. And he believed that these three stages are necessary for historical change, and that creates then the higher form of social and political life. For example, the French Revolution. It was a revolution that advanced the freedom, even though there were many negatives or contradictions or whatever. So Hegel portrays history as a rational progression toward greater freedom and self-awareness. So what are these terms? I hope you know. Thesis is the initial idea. So whenever there is an idea, there will be an opposition. That opposition is what? Antithesis. Now there is an idea, there is an opposition. Now this conflict will be resolved into something new. That is synthesis. So synthesis will have what? The goods from both sides, and that will become then the basis for, or that will become the new thesis. That is how revolution occurs. Like the French Revolution, for example, is in that way. There were people who were against it, and finally we came up with something which many democracies have been using or even succeeding revolutions. Next one, on Hegel's statement that state is the march of God on earth. So he believed that state is the highest form of ethical life. So state as ethical life, that true freedom is realized through participation in the rational state, where individual and universal interests are always together. And state is the realization of the world spirit. So it will unfold the rationality as well as the ethical development of humans. And he considered Prussia as the ideal state. Why? Because it was a rational and ethical state. So for conclusion, state is for him, or for Hegel, state is a supreme institution where freedom and rationality can actually be realized. Therefore, state is nothing but the march of God on earth. Now, what is Hegel's theory of state? So he rejects both extreme individualism and authoritarianism and saw the state as essential for what? Freedom. Now, state as the realization of freedom. Freedom is acting according to rational and universal laws, and state will give a framework as well as a place to synthesize the individual and collective will. So development of the state. State evolves historically through dialectical conflict. What is a dialectical conflict? Thesis, antithesis and synthesis. So there will always be higher forms of ethical life like the German state or nationalism. And it was his ideas that later influenced modern nationalism as well as ideas of statehood. So it embodies rational freedom and as well as enables individuals to flourish within an ethical community. Now, Hegel's views on civil society. So, civil society is the sphere of personal interest and economic activity, which is different from what state. And civil society is the realm of personal freedom. Now, individuals pursue private goals through markets, families, and associations with rights protected by law. The role of the state in civil society. The state organizes and regulates civil society to prevent conflict and ensure ethical unity. Example is a market economy wherein the state only regulates so as to prevent conflict and for unity. So Hegel supports the market but assures that state regulation is needed only for fairness and stability. So he provides individual freedom, but he believes that it is only the state that can ensure an order for its actual realization. Now, idealism and theory of state as formulated by Hegel. Hegel's idealism shapes his belief that the state is the highest realization of human freedom. Now, state as the realization of absolute spirit. History is what development of the spirit for a self-conscious freedom, which is expressed in the rational state. Now, freedom in the state. True freedom is through participation in ethical institutions based on universal laws. Example, the modern constitutional state, which reflects Hegel's emphasis on law, rationality, and common good. So his idealism frames the state as the ultimate ethical community where freedom and rationality are realized. Now, what is Hegel's concept of dialectics? So I think it's already discussed, but it is a basis for ideas, history, and reality through process of conflict and resolution. Moves from thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. There will be a higher stage of understanding at each level, and this cycle will continue, and that reveals a rational development of ideas. Now, dialectics and history. In history, it is contradictions between social and political systems that will advance the world spirit and that will produce more rational and free societies over time. For example, the master-slave dialectic. Slave will gain self-consciousness only through what? Labor and reflection. So, over a period of time, there will be freedom and mutually recognizing each other. You cannot achieve freedom if, let's say, the slave starts dominating the master. Then it will again be a continuation of what? Master-slave relation. So Hegel's dialectic shows that contradictions are essential for growth and that they shape the idea, society, and movement toward a greater realm or greater freedom, because that's the only way in which we grow over time. Next thinker is Edmund Burke. So as we know, Burke is a conservative critics. So first one, his views on American colonies. He supported the American colonies. Why? Because he valued historical continuity and prudence and a balanced imperial relationship. So he supported colonial rights. He argued that colonies had their own identity and there should not be a rigid rule. Heavy taxation and central control would damage the trust. What was his advocacy for dialogue and negotiation? He urged negotiation rather than coercion. In fact, his speech on conciliation with America urged that understanding their grievances is necessary, but at the same time they should not demand what? Freedom or to break away from it. For example, American Revolution he felt was wrong, which is why American Revolution happened. In fact, that revolution was wrong. If they had heeded to the grievances, there would not have been any upheaval. So he believed the empire should evolve with its colonies and avoid harsh, abstract policies that threatened the stability, because he was a conservative. He believed in status quo. He was against any kind of changes. And if at all change should happen, it should happen very slowly and very naturally. Next idea is his criticism of the French Revolution. In reflections on the revolution in France, he warned that radical change in abstract ideals would produce instability and violence. So he critiqued revolutionary ideals because they destroyed essential institutions. Why? Because these revolutions are pursuing ideals like equality without having any practical notion supporting them. Now, the dangers of abstract reason. He rejected the idea that societies can be redesigned by reason alone. In fact, we should respect the tradition because otherwise there will be disorder and unchecked power. He gave the example of reign of terror. In fact, the excess violence of terror was an example that when you try to overturn tradition, it will bring in chaos and not freedom. So he highlights a conservative belief in gradual change, inherited institutions, and was not in favor of radical reforms. I hope you know what Reign of Terror is. It was part of French Revolution. To be exact, right after the French, that creation of the First Republic, there were a series of massacres and executions. Why? Because when you bring in something very radical, there will be violent unrest. Okay, so the next idea is his views on citizenship and democracy. So he links citizenship to responsibility, tradition, and practical governance rather than mere democratic ideals. So what is the role of aristocracy? He believed a stable society requires an educated elite to guide public life and to balance popular will with experience and prudence. Then civic responsibility. Citizenship for Burke involved working within established institutions, respecting the tradition and contributing to social order, not merely voting. In fact, he appreciated the British constitution wherein there was monarchy, there was aristocracy and common people. So it was a combination of everything. The institutions were respected, tradition was respected, as well as social order. So a conclusion, democracy should be restrained by tradition and responsibility. What was his critique of natural rights and social contract? He rejected anything that was abstract because these natural right theories are nothing but abstract. In fact, he saw rights as historically rooted, they are not universal or self-evident. He criticized the natural rights because again those are very abstract. And because of that, there will be radical movements. Rights will exist only because of social traditions and they'll evolve through historical practice. Social contract is a historical process. Society is something very organic. So, political authority will grow from custom and collective experience, which is why French Revolution failed because it relied on ideals which are very abstract. So, which is why it collapsed and turned violent like the Reign of Terror. So he insisted that rights and authority must always come from history and tradition. What are his views on religion and toleration? So he saw religion as essential for moral order, but he was also supporting tolerance because that is needed for social harmony. And he saw religion as a pillar of social order. Why? Because Christianity shaped public virtue and then it also supports the moral foundations. But at the same time, he supported religious tolerance. Why? Because religious diversity and tolerance are needed for peace and stability. So what is the example is his support for Catholic emancipation. Because he supported their rights to reduce discrimination and for political unity. So he was in favor of moral role of religion as well as the need for a religious tolerance. It should not turn violent. What are Burke's criticism of natural rights? So Edmund Burke argued that rights must always be based in tradition and history, not abstract. And he considered natural rights abstract, and he was against Locke and Rousseau for this thing. Why? Because they ignored the social complexity. In fact, they kept promoting universal rights, irrespective of the context. Now, he gave importance to tradition and custom because tradition and custom is part of history. And again, French Revolution's failure was due to its support for abstract ideals. So he defended the rights that are rooted in custom and gradual development over abstract rationalist theories. Now the next thinker is Tocqueville. So what are his views on democracy and revolution? So Tocqueville's Democracy in America examines how democracy shapes societies and how a democracy, when it pursues equality, will lead to stability and revolutionary pressures. Next point is democracy as a force for social equality. So he saw democracy as a powerful equalizing force that can break down aristocratic hierarchies, but at the same time there is a threat of conformity and mediocrity. Now, democracy and revolution. Sometimes democratic expectations might be bigger than the institution's functioning. So when the institution fails to meet these demands, then even democratic societies are vulnerable to revolutionary upheaval, which is why French Revolution, because it was not a democratic society, but still their demand for democracy or equality is what destabilizes the systems. And when you have an extreme egalitarian impulse, even without strong institutions, can lead to disorder and violence. So democracy will promote equality and freedom, but it also needs stable institutions and respect for tradition. Otherwise, it will trigger revolutionary and violent impacts. The next subtopic is role of religion in politics according to Tocqueville. So Tocqueville viewed religion as a moral anchor that supports democracy by moderating its individualistic tendencies. So he saw religion as counterbalance to individualism. Because since democracy is for self-focus and materialism, religion will give that moral compass to bring in restraint, charity and civil responsibility. Religion and democratic stability. Religious belief is again positive for democratic values because it teaches what restraint, charity and civic responsibility, right? So that is personal interest lesser than common good. So there will not be democratic excess like the American experiment. In America, Protestant Christianity shaped the civic virtue and social discipline. Though it was not part of politics, religion supported these public morals. So for conclusion, religion will stabilize democracy and provide moral foundation that is needed to prevent excessive individualism and therefore maintain democratic order. Tocqueville's views on democracy, revolution and modern state. So he analyzed how democracy transforms political institutions. He warned about both its liberating and centralizing tendencies. He anticipated the rise of a powerful central bureaucracy, and that central bureaucracy can protect rights but it will reduce individual autonomy. Now revolutionary tendencies, because when the demands for equality heightens or when the expectations are not met, then they will lead to revolutionary pressures like French Revolution. That exemplified how even traditional regimes, when it propagates inequality, then it will lead to social rupture. So democracy can also expand rights and equality, but at the same time it can centralize the state power and provoke revolutionary unrest. Then his statement on despotism and liberty. Tocqueville warned that democratic societies risk replacing all tyrannies with newer but very indirect or very minute forms of despotism. Now what is despotism and democratic majority? When there is a rule of majority, it can become tyranny, and then public opinion might become so dominant that individual freedoms might be eroded. Liberty in the face of despotism. Democratic citizens may even give in their freedom for security or conformity. That will even enable the bureaucracy to slowly restrict liberty, like the control of bureaucracy, because the states will expand their administrative structures and individuals will start becoming more dependent on them, and that becomes despotic in the long run. So democracies must always be protective or aware about this soft despotism, which is the gradual loss of liberty by a centralized administration and majority pressure. So this is something that I've already discussed, but let's go through it again because ये काफ़ी बार repeat हो चुकी है. Tocqueville's views on democracy and modern state. Tocqueville explored how democratic societies reshape political authority, particularly through centralization, the rise of bureaucracy and centralization. He argued that democratic nations tend to expand centralized bureaucracy, which can limit personal initiative and freedom, the tension between liberty and equality. Democracy's push for equality can lead citizens to accept growing state control and trade liberty for security and uniformity like in United States. He praised the American local self-government but warned that over time even US could see a federal power overshadowing these individual autonomies. Now for conclusion, democracy will create what freedom and a temptation for centralized control. So you need to balance equality with liberty. Now what are his views on religion? He saw religion, especially Christianity, as vital to the moral health of democratic societies. In fact, he felt that it will restrain the democratic excess through moral discipline. So it will prevent any extreme individualism. And he gave the example of American Protestant society, wherein even without the control of the state, it was a religion that shaped their civic character and brought in self-restraint. So for him, religion safeguards democracy. Again, the importance of religion in politics, according to Tocqueville. He argued that while religion and government should remain separate, it is indispensable for democratic stability. It will provide a moral framework of responsibility, self-restraint and civic duty. And religion can limit tyranny by growing or working on individual conscience, like the religious influence in American democracy. So, religion supports liberty, limits democratic excess, and provides a moral structure that allows democracy to function. Next thinker is Marx. So, what is Marxian dialectics? Marx used dialectics to explain social change through conflict and contradictions. He took the idea from Hegel, but he sort of reframed it. So, what is dialectical materialism? He replaced Hegel's focus on ideas with material conditions, and he said that economic structures and class conflict, especially between bourgeoisie and proletariat, drive the historical transformation. So, this dialectical process is through thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and each new social order will emerge by resolving the contradictions within previous one. Example, transition from feudalism to capitalism. Feudalism was the thesis which gave to antithesis, that is capitalism, and its contradictions is what led towards socialism or communism, which is the synthesis. So while Hegel focused on ideas, Marx focused on structures and class conflict. That's the only difference. So his dialectics explains social evolution through material contradictions, especially within economic systems. Next is Marx's theory of revolution. He saw revolution as inevitable result of capitalist contradictions and class struggle. Now, what is the role of proletariat? He will become aware of its exploitation and will try to overthrow the bourgeoisie, abolish private property, and establish collective ownership. Dictatorship of the proletariat in a transitionist socialist state will dismantle the capitalism that will lead to classless communist society, like the Russian Revolution in 1917, which attempted to apply Marx's ideas. Though in the long run it did not bring in immediate communism, brought in authoritarianism, the ideals were influenced by this dictatorship of the proletariat and overthrow of the bourgeoisie. So, revolution arises from exploitation and class conflict, and it aims to replace capitalism with socialism and communism. Now, what is Marx's theory of class war? He argued that class struggle is the engine of historical development. Capitalism will divide the society into owners and workers. So, that is an exploitative relationship. And this class struggle will be the motor or the reason for growth of history. Conflicts will shape the institutions, and capitalism would fall once its contradictions are intensified, like French Revolution. The bourgeoisie overthrew the feudal nobility, and that was because class tensions were driving the revolutionary change. Then comes his theory of alienation. That is an important question. Alienation describes how capitalism disconnects workers from their labor, products, even other humans, and their own human potential. So, how are they alienated from productive labor? Workers do not own what they produce. This leaves them powerless and detached from the value they create. Now, how they are alienated from the labor process? Work is repetitive and it's always controlled by capitalists. There is no creativity and autonomy. Now, alienation from other people. Competition will replace cooperation, and that will isolate workers from one another. Like the industrial factory workers, wherein the factory labor laws are all about alienation. You have repetitive tasks, little control, and you are not connected to the final product in any way. So, for conclusion, it is a core feature of capitalist exploitation, and it contributes to workers' eventual revolutionary awareness. It is these alienation that sort of forces them to sort of come up and fight against the existing system. Next is Marx's statement on economic structure of society. So for intro, we can say that it is economic structures that shape all aspects of society, according to Marx, especially in historical materialism. Now, base and superstructure. Economic base is the productive forces and relations, which determines a superstructure like politics, law, and culture. Now, changes in the base will transform the entire society. So, economic determinism, that is a shift in the mode of production, will bring about major social and political changes. For example, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. When capitalism came in, new laws, ideologies, and institutions were formed for new economic order. So, when the base changed, superstructure also changed. So, material conditions are the basis for society's foundation. Institutional change will happen due to these economic change. What is Marx's idea of historical materialism? It will explain history through changes in material conditions and modes of production. Now, what is material conditions as foundation of society? These are the forces and relations of production which shape the social institutions, politics, and ideology. What are the stages of historical development? There are stages like primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and then again communism. Each of them will have its own economic structure. For example, this transition from feudalism to capitalism. When there were changes in production that undermined feudalism and that led to new legal and cultural systems which aided capitalism. So historical change is through the evolving economic systems and the class struggles that occurs within them. Now, what did Marx say on surplus value? Surplus value explains the capitalist profit as well as worker exploitation. The labor theory of value. Workers create more value than that they are paid for, and this unpaid value or this unpaid labor is the surplus value, which is a feature in capitalism. So there is exploitation in capitalism. Capitalists get the profit by the surplus value, which is through the workers. So that is again inequality, like a factory worker's labor. For example, if a worker produces $200 worth of goods, but he is only paid $100, then that remaining $100 is surplus value. That's a profit for the capitalist, which is why Marx was against this system. So surplus value will reveal how capitalism extracts profit through systemic exploitation of labor. So it is the capitalist profit, but it's exploitation of the worker. Now, the last area is methodological and conceptual issues. So first is nature and content of Western political thought. So Western political thought originated from ancient Greece to modern ideologies, and that has shaped our ideas on justice, liberty, democracy, rights, and governance. So what are the origins of Western political thought? We can align it to thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, who explored the nature of state, justice, and citizenship, which laid the foundation of Western political inquiry. Now, what are the key themes? It includes political authority, individual liberty, law and morality, power distribution, and democratic development. Now, this growth from classical to modern political thought. Christian thinkers like Augustine or Aquinas, they blended theology with politics. Later writers like Machiavelli, Locke, Rousseau, and Marx, they developed further ideas on power, rights, social contracts, and class. So, Western political thought is a long dialogue on justice, power, and the individual's role, which still continues to shape the modern political theory. Now, what is the relevance of classical tradition in Western political thought? Greek and Roman thinkers were the founders, or they laid the foundation for concepts like justice, power, virtue, and citizenship, which still influence modern political debates. Now, the enduring influence of classical thought, Plato's ideal rulers, as well as Aristotle's classification of governments, that still guide discussions on leadership and political structure. Classical views on justice and common good. Classical thinkers emphasize virtue, moral citizenship, and politics aimed at the common good. Now, what is the relevance in contemporary context? Classical ideas inform modern debates on democracy, citizenship, human rights, and just governance. So, the classical tradition again offers timeless insights that continue to shape political theory and practice. Now, political thought, how is it different from political theory and political philosophy? Although they overlap, they are different in focus. History of ideas is what political thought is. Normative analysis is political theory, and ethical foundations is the political philosophy. So, political thought is on the historical development of political ideas from ancient to modern and how they have shaped various institutions. Political theory addresses the questions like on justice, rights, ideal political arrangements, all of that through reasons. Political philosophy will investigate the moral and ethical foundations of political life, which focus on authority, rights, and the individual-state relationship. Now, for conclusion, thought is historical, theory is normative, and philosophy is ethically foundational. Again, a different answer for the same question. Political thought will focus on ideas evolved across eras and influence systems of power, justice, and freedom. Political theory will examine what political systems ought to be and how power should be organized justly. Political philosophy will focus on moral principles behind political life, including rights, justice, and legitimate authority. So, political thought will look at history, theory will look at the norms, and philosophy will look deeper within the ethics. What are the major characteristics of Western political thought? So, it reflects evolving ideas of power, rights, justice, and governance. Firstly, focus on individual rights and freedom. Thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, all of them emphasized natural rights and liberty, which is central to democratic development. The democratic ideals, debates on democracy, citizen participation, balancing majority rule with individual rights, all of them are central themes. What is the influence of classical and Christian thought? Greek philosophy shaped the political reasoning, while Christianity influenced moral and ethical perspective. The development of the state and political institutions. Western thought examines how states and institutions maintain order, legitimacy, and justice. So, for conclusion, its defining themes like rights, democracy, state, classical, and Christian influences are the basis of Western political systems. Now, why do we say that Western political thought deals largely with political institutions? Because a major focus is always on explaining how institutions like state, law, and government maintain order and justice. So, state and governance, Hobbes emphasized order, Locke emphasized rights, while Rousseau and Marx focused on making the state more just and participatory. Political institutions and democracy. Western thought studies how democratic institutions like rule of law, separation of power, checks and balance, all of them protect freedom and ensure accountability. Then political institutions are the basis of Western political theory because they are seen as essential tools for social order, justice, and democratic governance. So with this, we have come to the end of MPSC 3, that is Western political thought. Hope I've made sense to all of you. मैंने जितने भी क्वेश्चंस हैं उन सब के आंसर्स दिए, मैंने उनको छोटे छोटे दिए ताकि you can, it is easier to revise. Hope you like it. So thanks for watching. Do subscribe, like, share and comment, और आपका सपोर्ट देते रहिएगा, आगे भी और पेपर्स आएंगे. Thank you.